The courtroom felt colder than Daniel had imagined. It wasn't just the marble floors or the polished wooden benches. It was the way every eye seemed to pierce through him, silently weighing his worth as a father. He sat at the defendant's table, staring at the judge who barely looked his way. Across from him, Claire, his ex-wife, sat tall and composed, a faint smile curling at her lips as if she already knew victory was hers. This wasn't just about custody. It was about control, power, and the story Claire had spun so carefully. Claire had always been convincing, even during their marriage. She could twist an argument until Daniel questioned his own memory of events. Now, with carefully rehearsed lines and her lawyer's guidance, she made Daniel look like a monster. She painted herself as the protective mother shielding Emily from an unstable and dangerous father. Each word stabbed at Daniel's chest, and he could see the judge scribbling notes that looked damning. The worst part wasn't just hearing the lies. It was watching the way others believed them. Neighbors who had once waved to him now sat in the witness area, ready to testify that they had heard shouting or seen bruises, without knowing the truth. The prosecutor flipped through folders full of evidence. Photographs of Emily looking sad or scared, moments Claire had staged when Daniel wasn't around. And still, Daniel wasn't allowed to speak, not yet. He had to sit there, silent, as his entire identity as a father was dragged through the mud. Daniel's lawyer leaned over and whispered for him to remain calm, to trust the process. But the process felt rigged. Every look from the judge, every nod at Claire's words, deepened Daniel's fear that he was losing this battle before it had even begun. His hands shook beneath the table, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on Emily, who sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, her small legs swinging nervously. She avoided both parents' eyes, as though torn between two worlds. Daniel clenched his fists under the table, silently pleading with fate. This wasn't just a legal case. It was his daughter's future. If Claire's lies stood unchallenged, Emily would grow up thinking her father was a villain. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in, suffocating him with every passing minute. And though he sat quietly, his heart was screaming, "How much longer can I endure this before the truth is lost forever?" Claire's lawyer began presenting the so-called evidence, and every page that hit the judge's desk felt like another nail in Daniel's coffin. The first stack of documents contained what looked like medical reports. Papers stamped with hospital logos, bearing Emily's name and describing injuries Claire claimed were caused by Daniel. Bruises on her arm, a sprain from being pushed too hard. The courtroom gasped as each report was read aloud. Daniel knew these were lies, but to the judge and jury, the documents appeared legitimate, official, and undeniable. Then came the photographs. Claire's attorney projected them onto a large screen so everyone in the courtroom could see. There was Emily, her face pale, her eyes swollen with tears, her tiny hand clutching her arm. Another photo showed her sitting on her bed, with a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. To strangers, these images screamed of abuse and neglect. But Daniel remembered those nights vividly. Emily had been crying over nightmares, not bruises. Claire had waited until the right moment to snap the pictures, weaponizing her own daughter's vulnerability. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder with each exhibit. "How could a father do this?" Someone muttered from the back. Another spectator shook their head, glaring at Daniel with disgust. Daniel felt the walls close in again, his chest tightening. He wanted to stand up and shout the truth, to explain how manipulative Claire was, but the judge's strict rules silenced him. If he spoke out of turn, it would only make him look unstable, exactly what Claire wanted. Adding to the deception, Claire took the stand with trembling hands and a quivering voice. She described incidents that had never happened: Daniel throwing plates, screaming at Emily, and even locking her in her room for hours. She cried at the right moments, dabbed her eyes with tissues, and let her voice break in just the right places. Every detail was rehearsed, perfected, and delivered with the confidence of someone who knew she could control the narrative. The judge leaned in, listening closely, while Daniel sat frozen in disbelief. The more Claire spoke, the more it seemed like the truth. Every detail, every prop, the reports, the photos, the testimonies, fit together into a story that was carefully constructed. And the scariest part, Daniel realized he had no way of proving otherwise. Lies, when dressed in the clothing of truth, are harder to fight than any weapon. He lowered his eyes to the table, heart pounding, wondering how long he could endure watching the woman who once swore to love him turn into his executioner in the eyes of the court. Daniel sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his chair. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to speak, to defend himself against the tidal wave of lies crashing down on him. But his lawyer's warning echoed in his mind. Stay calm. If you interrupt, you'll look unstable. Let me handle it. Those words felt like chains, binding him to silence while Claire's performance poisoned the courtroom. Each second of restraint cost him dearly, his silence mistaken for guilt. Inside, a storm raged. Memories of birthdays, bedtime stories, and Emily's laughter filled his mind. Moments Claire had twisted into shadows. He wanted to stand up and say, "This is not who I am. Ask my daughter. She knows the truth." But the rules of the courtroom gagged him. Every outburst could be seen as aggression. Every raised tone could be recorded as instability. So Daniel bit his tongue, his jaw tight, his heart hammering against his ribs as though trying to escape his chest. The judge's eyes flicked to him occasionally, cold and assessing. To an outsider, Daniel's silence looked like indifference, maybe even shame. Claire thrived on that perception. Every time she glanced at him, her lips curved into a subtle, taunting smile, as if daring him to break, to lash out, to give her the final piece of evidence she needed. Daniel lowered his gaze, refusing to meet her eyes, but inside he was burning with the injustice of it all. He thought of Emily, sitting at the back of the courtroom, her small body lost in the giant wooden bench. What was she thinking? Did she believe her mother's lies? Or did she still remember the truth? The nights he stayed up with her when she was sick, the weekends spent building forts and reading fairy tales. Daniel's silence wasn't just about surviving the trial. It was about not frightening his daughter. One wrong move, and she could be convinced that her father was the monster her mother described. The silence became unbearable, like a weight pressing on his chest. It wasn't just silence. It was forced stillness in the face of betrayal. He was being painted as a villain in front of strangers, yet he wasn't allowed to defend himself. His lawyer scribbled notes furiously, preparing for cross-examination. But to Daniel, it all felt too slow, too weak. He wanted to scream, to tear the mask off Claire's lies. but all he could do was sit there, his truth trapped behind clenched teeth, while the courtroom's sympathy leaned further and further away from him. The courtroom shifted when the judge cleared his throat and announced that Emily would testify. A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected his little girl to be pulled into the storm like this. Not here, not in front of so many strangers. His palms grew damp, his throat dry. Emily was only 9. Could she handle this? Could she even find the courage to speak? Or worse, would she repeat the lies her mother had forced into her? All eyes turned toward the back of the courtroom as Emily rose hesitantly. Her small frame seemed even smaller against the towering benches and heavy oak walls. She clutched the sleeve of the court officer leading her to the witness stand, her steps hesitant, almost trembling. Daniel felt his chest ache as he watched her climb into the chair, her feet dangling inches above the floor. She looked fragile, like a bird caught in a storm. Yet the entire trial now seemed to hinge on the words that would come out of her mouth. Claire's smile returned, sly and confident, as though she had been waiting for this very moment. Daniel knew why. Claire had likely coached Emily, drilling the lies into her until they felt like truth. He could almost hear Claire's manipulative whispers. "If you want Mommy to be happy, you'll say this. If you love me, you won't forget what to tell the judge." The thought sickened him, twisting his stomach into knots. He wanted to leap across the courtroom, scoop Emily up, and shield her from the eyes that now dissected her every movement. But all he could do was sit there, helpless. The judge leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Emily, do you know why you're here today?" She nodded slightly, her lips parting as though she might speak, but no sound came out at first. The room was silent, so silent Daniel swore he could hear the rapid thud of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Emily swallowed hard, clutching the wooden edge of the stand with her tiny hands, her knuckles white. Her eyes darted nervously between her mother, her father, and the judge, as though she were standing on a razor's edge. Daniel leaned forward, his breath shallow, his entire soul straining toward his daughter. He wanted to send her courage without words, to let her know he believed in her no matter what came next. The air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation, every spectator holding their breath. What would Emily say? Would she repeat her mother's carefully rehearsed lies? Or would the truth, raw and unfiltered, finally break free from her trembling lips? The judge's question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Emily's lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but at first only a whisper escaped, so soft that even Daniel, straining with every fiber of his being, couldn't catch the words. The judge leaned closer, asking her to speak up, his voice unusually gentle. Emily's eyes flicked toward her mother. Claire's smile had tightened into something sharper, her gaze piercing, warning, commanding. It was the look of a puppeteer tugging invisible strings. Daniel felt a chill crawl down his spine. For a moment, Emily hesitated, as though torn between two worlds. The safe lie her mother had forced on her, and the fragile truth that weighed on her heart. Her hands twisted in her lap, her small shoulders rising and falling in uneven breaths. Then, in a voice louder than before, she said, "Mom told me to lie." The words were so unexpected, so raw, that the entire courtroom froze. Daniel blinked, wondering if he'd misheard. But no, there it was, the sentence that cracked open the carefully constructed facade Claire had built. A murmur spread through the spectators like wildfire, disbelief rippling through the room. The judge straightened, eyebrows furrowing, his pen pausing mid-stroke. Claire's face blanched, and she immediately leaned forward, her voice sharp, almost frantic. "Emily, sweetheart, you must be confused. You don't know what you're saying." But Emily's voice grew stronger, steadier, her eyes now locked on the judge. "She made me practice. She told me to say Daddy hurt me. But he didn't, he never did." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He felt tears sting his eyes, but he dared not blink. Not even for a second, afraid that the fragile courage spilling from his daughter might vanish if he let go of the moment. The judge raised a hand, silencing Claire's protests. His gaze fixed on the little girl who had just shattered the courtroom's certainty. Emily's words cut through the silence like a blade, slicing away at the lies that had suffocated Daniel for weeks. The weight of her confession lingered, pressing on everyone present. Lawyers shuffled uncomfortably. Spectators leaned forward, hanging on every word. Even the judge's usually impassive expression betrayed a flicker of surprise. And there, in the center of it all, sat Emily, tiny, trembling, but unflinching now, having thrown the first stone against the mountain of deceit her mother had built. The truth was out, fragile but undeniable, and Daniel could feel the tide of the trial beginning to shift, though the storm was far from over. The moment Emily's words echoed through the courtroom, Claire's composure cracked. Her confident smile vanished, replaced by a mask of panic. She shot up from her chair, her voice shrill, desperate. "That's not true!" "She's just a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." The outburst drew startled gasps from the gallery. Claire, who had spent weeks portraying herself as calm, collected, and victimized, now looked frantic, her polished act unraveling before everyone's eyes. Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently, but Claire wouldn't be silenced. She leaned forward, glaring at Emily as if sheer force of will could pull her back into submission. "Emily, remember what we talked about. Remember how Daddy scared you. Tell them." Her voice cracked on the last words, high-pitched and trembling, her desperation staining every syllable. But the more she spoke, the more obvious her manipulation became. The courtroom, once swayed by her tears, now shifted uneasily, watching her with suspicion. Daniel sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe. For the first time since the trial began, he saw the mask peel away, revealing the woman he had known in private, the controlling, vindictive Claire who twisted truths until they served her. She was no longer the grieving mother she had pretended to be. She was a cornered liar, thrashing wildly as the walls closed in. Daniel's lawyer leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, as though silently acknowledging that the tide had finally turned. The judge's gavel struck the desk sharply. "Mrs. Morgan, sit down." His voice was cold, commanding, no longer indulgent of her theatrics. Claire froze mid-protest, her eyes darting wildly from the judge to the jury to the spectators. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her hands trembling as she lowered herself back into her seat. But even then, her lips kept moving, whispering under her breath, half to herself, half to her lawyer, insisting she was telling the truth. That Emily was just confused, that the child was being manipulated by her father. But no one seemed to believe her anymore. The once Sympathetic spectators now exchanged wary glances, whispering behind cupped hands. The jury members shifted in their seats, their faces tight with doubt. And Claire, realizing the power she once held was slipping away, sat rigid in her chair, her eyes burning with rage and fear. The collapse had begun, not in silence, but in a storm of denial, each frantic word only tightening the noose of suspicion around her. The courtroom sat in stunned silence after Emily's testimony and Claire's outburst. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the weight shift, not fully lifted, but no longer crushing him. The judge's gaze softened when it landed on him. Though his expression remained guarded, it was as if the entire room had finally glimpsed the possibility that Daniel was not the monster Claire had painted him to be. But suspicion still lingered, thick in the air, as though the truth itself was on trial. Daniel's lawyer rose slowly, pacing in front of the jury, his voice calm but cutting. He reminded them of every inconsistency in Claire's story. The staged photos, the conveniently timed medical reports, the absence of credible witnesses who had actually seen Daniel commit violence. Then he gestured gently toward Emily, whose small shoulders were hunched, but whose words had pierced the courtroom like lightning. "Sometimes," he said softly, "truth comes from the smallest voice in the room." His words echoed, leaving the gallery hushed and uneasy. Claire sat motionless, her hands clenched into fists, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury. She knew the case was slipping from her grasp, but she refused to surrender. Her lawyer shuffled papers frantically, trying to recover control, but nothing could erase the image of a frightened child confessing she had been told to lie. The damage was done. And as the judge scribbled something into his notes, Claire's composure fractured further, her jaw tightening until it trembled. Daniel's eyes remained fixed on Emily, who now sat quietly, staring down at her lap. His heart ached at the sight of her exhaustion, the weight of the burden she had carried alone until this moment. He wanted to rush to her, to gather her in his arms and tell her how proud he was. But the trial wasn't over. Not yet. The silence between every gavel strike, every lawyer's objection, every flick of the judge's pen felt endless, stretching time like a taut string ready to snap. The gallery buzzed with whispers now, the spell of Claire's lies broken, but not fully destroyed. The jury shifted, the judge's face unreadable, and Daniel sat waiting for the official word that could change his life forever. The truth had been spoken, but truth alone wasn't always enough. The final judgment had yet to be delivered, and until then, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that fragile space between justice and uncertainty. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression solemn. For a long moment, the courtroom was silent except for the scratching of his pen against paper. Then, with a voice steady and firm, he delivered the words Daniel had been praying for. "Custody will be granted to the father. The mother is found to have manipulated evidence and coerced testimony." The sound of the gavel striking wood reverberated like thunder, sealing Claire's downfall. Claire slumped in her chair, her face pale and defeated. The web of lies she had spun so carefully had unraveled in a matter of minutes, exposed by the very child she thought she could control. Her protests were weak now, her voice hollow, drowned out by the murmurs of the gallery. She was no longer the victim. She was the deceiver, and everyone knew it. Daniel rose slowly, his legs trembling as though they no longer remembered how to hold him. When Emily was led down from the witness stand, he met her halfway. She threw her arms around him, burying her face into his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the crushing weight lift from his shoulders. "You saved me," he whispered into her hair. "You saved us both." You spectators who had once glared at him with suspicion now watched with softened eyes. Some nodded, others whispered to each other, their judgment replaced with quiet respect. The courtroom, once filled with tension and hostility, now carried a heavy silence of realization. Truth, fragile though it had been, had prevailed in the end. As Daniel walked out of the courtroom with Emily's hand in his, he knew the battle had left scars that time would not easily heal. But he also knew this. His daughter's courage had not only restored his honor, but had given him a second chance at fatherhood. And in that moment, he vowed never to let lies or fear steal her voice, or their bond, ever again.
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.